I happened to be sitting down with a financial advisor, and he said, no use of AI anywhere, anyhow. And he's like, let me tell you how this has changed my life. It's amazing. And so he shows me how he's got his personal iPad out, how he has the personal iPad listen in on his call with the client and do exactly the use case that we've all seen at this point. It summarizes the call. It highlights the action items. It drafts his first response back to the client to follow up. And then he has it send from his personal email to his work email. And then he just copies and pastes it into the CRM system.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as, how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is Emily Hu, partner at Bain & Company. Emily, welcome to the show.
Ankur, great to be with you.
So Emily, what were you most recently doing? And then perhaps it would be beneficial for our audience to learn a little bit about your own story and how you got to where you are.
Most recently, I was making Thanksgiving pie, acknowledging that tomorrow is U.S. Thanksgiving. So we'll see how well that turns out. But in terms of my own talking professional journey, I've spent the last 15 plus years specifically focused on transformation in insurance, whether that is helping an insurance carrier enable modern technology and digital capabilities in their legacy operating environment, whether that's helping them harness a customer service experience that is modern, but working with their existing stuff, the spaghetti of existing and legacy technology, to be effective in our modern world.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about some of the inflection points that you've seen? Because the last 50 years, I mean, there have been quite a lot of change, right? And I think it's accelerated in some ways with generative AI, but could we talk about some of the inflection points that you've seen over the years?
There's been several. So I think about my own journey as a career consultant. At one point, about 15 years ago, I got a call from Tokyo Marine and an offer to run U.S. strategy for them. This was when they were doing big acquisitions like Philadelphia Consolidated. And so coming in, apart from figuring out our go-to-market strategy, one of the big challenges that was on our collective plates was, what do we do about policy admin? And at that time, when we're talking about policy administration systems and insurance, the typical timeline for doing anything is 7 years. And that's after you've already done some data cleansing effort that may take many years on its own. So in some ways, these were always challenges that were career enders in some ways, because there was just so many ways that they could fail. Fast forward to where we are today, and things that in 2010 we didn't even talk about are the norm. Things like APIs, which seem like an obvious thing, but that's been progress for us in insurance, to be able to even think about solutions that can be plug and play more so than they've been in the past.
When we talk to a lot of enterprises, the term digital transformation comes up a lot, right? And I think a lot of people in the community, of course, have heard it, seen it, do it. But what makes innovation so difficult that it has to be thought of as this big digital transformation exercise that then takes 3-5 years, maybe more over time to go into?
Back to your earlier question on how have things evolved, I think we're in an era now where that doesn't have to be the case. So we don't have to think about capital T transformation enterprise-wide. We can take portions of the enterprise and really see material change and transformation in those specific areas, and then plug them back in together for that end-to-end experience.
And I think that's beautiful to see. It's really kind of the ethos of modern software development, even, right? Which is you want to have the strategy up front, but then the execution you want to have a lot more nimbleness around that. And when you think about it with a capital T, then of course it has to go through multiple committee reviews and a budgeting exercise, and you're just planning for like the next year to then kick off a big endeavor, which then takes another 5 years. And so some of the people that planned it may not even be in the role in the seats, right? And so becomes really unwieldy to manage over that very long time scale.
And the other portion of that too is how do you see the win or the benefits? And sometimes when you think about that enterprise-wide transformation, the benefit doesn't come until the end of the transformation. Whereas if you can make it more modular, you're able to achieve incremental benefits over that timeline, and it's huge.
Yeah, so I think we lived through an era of big data, analytics, all forms of machine learning, predictive analytics, predictive AI. I'm curious, like 10 years ago, let's say, what did digital transformations look like? What did that involve? And then, we'll get back to this, but then I'm very curious sort of what it looks like today when companies think of newer technologies like generative AI.
In insurance, I'm not telling you anything that you haven't lived also. One of the challenges we continue to experience in our industry is a result of the lack of investment over, some might say, many decades in our technology environment. So 10 years ago, that meant we were having conversations about cloud, yes or no. And what is our cloud strategy? How do we go to the cloud? And, anything we talked about required often large heart of the business solutions, technology solutions to be transformed. So it wasn't uncommon to find a carrier that was using a policy admin system that might be 40 years old or more. Some mainframe that frankly worked reasonably well for what they wanted to do. And when they ran the numbers and tried to do an ROI on a new system, it just didn't pencil out for where they were in terms of investment and benefit. And then you go through an era of consolidation back in the 80s and 90s. And then you have organizations that have multiple policy admin systems that may or may not talk to each other, data lakes that may or may not exist, that may or may not be on the cloud. And then how do you harness all of that to actually do something when we say, oh, let's build an app or let's deliver a modern customer experience? And so we, looking back to even 10 years, we've come very far in terms of being able to even talk about vended solutions versus having to really bring something in-house and customize it to make it address some of the legacy challenges.
And there seems to be a much more of an awareness that things need to change, right? And part of that is maybe demographics oriented, where you have very experienced veterans essentially that are about to retire, and in insurance that's maybe most visible, and then you don't quite have as much younger talent that's coming to the forefront. And even when they do come, they don't quite have the experience and expertise that the veterans do. And so there's this big generational gap of both number of bodies, but then just experience that you need to really go and do these complex endeavors. And so I think a lot of people in insurance are looking at potentially technology as being a helpful solution in that. And I think there's this awareness that this way of doing things for decades on end and the maybe more sluggish pace of innovation needs to change. So you see all this new kind of excitement around insurtech, maybe AI as being a major catalyst. How much have things stayed the same, and how much have things started to improve so that it's easier for these larger carriers and such to go and bring in newer technologies like generative AI?
I think positive pressure to the list that you just shared, Ankur, is that whether we're the employee or the financial advisor or the insured or any of the stakeholders in that value chain of insurance, we have expectations these days. So if I'm an employee and I'm getting a job at an insurance carrier and I sit down for orientation and I'm looking at a green screen, guess what I'm not going to do is stay in that job. And similarly, if I go to apply for a life insurance policy and my advisor pulls out a piece of paper that has to be filled out long form, I'm shocked and appalled. So there's expectations that we all have now just through our other interactions and day-to-day lives that we're bringing into insurance as well. And that's a benefit, or at least a positive pressure for change.
I think it makes sense. Like we as consumers have seen remarkable experiences from a user experience perspective, and we now want that. We in some ways demand that, right? So I think that is that positive pressure that's coming to the forefront here. But when it comes to adoption of newer technologies, bringing them into the organization, how much has the maybe decision-making process remain the same, like in the era of digital transformation, versus how much of it has really kind of become a lot easier for these larger enterprises to go and experiment and try new things and innovate maybe in a more nimble fashion?
There's a couple things that I would point to. The first, I do think it's easier to experiment. Experimentation has always been there. I think what has improved is the ability to experiment at scale and go from experimentation to engaging the organization in a way that would allow for that experiment to actually be adopted. And a lot of what we talked about with regard to technology and tech modernization has enabled that. The other element that's one, I think also I wouldn't want to discount the solutions that are being provided by the tech industry and the insurtech innovation that we're seeing. That's huge. And just being able to see that level of engagement from the broader community, not just within the carriers, goes a long way. The other element that I would point to as improving or accelerating adoption is more and more I'm seeing joint decision making at the senior levels between technology and business. So that it's not just IT saying this is our decision on fill in the blank solution, or business saying, I don't care what the organization more broadly says or needs or can or can't do, I'm putting in this solution. But when the head of operations or the business unit president and the CIO together can jointly make that decision, it's so much more powerful in terms of accelerating the adoption and moving forward with that.
And what tends to work better? So, I mean, we've seen a couple of approaches, but one is you have a centralized function that is determining which use cases are worth experimenting on, and they help with selection of vendors. So it's like central command versus like a more federated approach, a more decentralized approach, which means that the individual teams, the teams that are closest to the business units, they get to pick and choose, right? And there are pros and cons because I think the centralized unit, they can kind of reduce some of the waste potentially. Like there's not a redundant activity that's happening, but at the same time, it tends to be bottlenecked a bit, right? Because the queues end up building up and there are many business units that need to be served. So I'm curious from your experience, which tends to work better, or is it a case by case basis?
Perhaps no surprise, as someone that spent a lot of her career in consulting, where consulting firms are always matrixed. In my opinion, the answer is somewhere in the middle. So where you can harness some sort of centralized center of excellence or centralized brain trust of depth of capability, but pair that at the lowest possible level into the business to develop solutions, that's really where you see the benefit. A lot of times where you see some inefficiencies is when the central function makes the decision entirely in isolation. They don't truly have the finger on the pulse of the problem that's trying to be solved or needs to be solved. And so the solution doesn't get to that last mile as it needs to. Conversely, I'm sure you and I could both point to times where maybe someone has some budget and they go rogue, so to speak, right? And they introduce some solution that works in a very narrow set, but actually the cost to plug that in or the challenges that the organization might have to plug in that solution at scale quickly outweighs the benefit of whatever they're trying to do in their narrow set. So somewhere in the middle is the Goldilocks of answers.
I think there are benefits to both. And when I look at it as like the centralized unit, let's say you have center of excellence, they're able to do a lot of good R&D and evaluation, get best practices. But in some ways, like that final mile experimentation, the experimentation with the teams who are closest to the business units in their respective areas, they get to learn a lot more quickly, right? There is enablement, they have their own budget, they go and do that. But then the goal is to go and work with the center of excellence, the central unit, to share learnings, because that central unit then could disseminate that know-how and knowledge, both good and bad, to the rest of the last mile units that work closer with the business unit. So somewhere in between, I think, is probably the right way to do it. You need to have that proper balance, because if you lean too much in one way, then yeah, you have players that end up being rogue. They make decisions in isolation of the broader organization. And frankly, there isn't good learnings, right? Because every single team is kind of learning from scratch all over again when they should be learning from the shared experiences across the organization. But if it's too tightly controlled, the reins are too tightly controlled by a central unit, then you stifle some of the innovation, right? And a central unit may not be as close to the business function to really understand what really motivates them, what their needs are, and everything kind of gets slow because it's just like a traffic problem, right? It's like things get gridlocked when you have a single choke point that people have to go through.
The other challenge that I've seen in that centralized model also, even with the best of intentions and the best of implementation, that central function will always go to the next highest ROI. And so as long as they're always focused on where the greatest impact is, then those capabilities don't get rolled out to the front lines in a way for smaller needs. Frankly, the ROI for the enterprise may be lower, but you do have people that are going to be engaged at the front lines that are going to be very keen to take those tools and build solutions that work in their function. And that's what you want. You'd like that with some coordination across the enterprise. But you don't, that tight control, even with the best of intentions, can sometimes hobble the value that you want to see across the board.
So one of the, I guess, the realizations 2 years into this generative AI era with ChatGPT coming out in November 2022 is that consulting firms of all shapes and sizes are some of the primary beneficiaries of growth and experimentation that's happening in this space. And it's everything from management consulting to technology consulting and such. And it often feels like enterprise turn to their consultants of choice to go and accelerate the experimentation, understand best practices, get some of the common learnings that the consulting firm may have because they've worked with so many other enterprise players. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, what is happening with enterprises that are experimenting, perhaps with some of the major consulting firms, to go and very quickly understand how to work with generative AI and implement it so it's useful in production?
The advice I would have in the broadest strokes would be, first and foremost, as you're looking for outside expertise, whether that is from a consulting firm, whether that is from a startup even, I always lead with industry knowledge. So whomever you're speaking with or whatever the solution is that you may be looking at, is it purpose-built for your industry? Or someone coming to you saying, hey, we've got this really shiny thing called ChatGPT, or fill in the blank, any number of models. And it's really cool. And I'm sure we can find a way to use it for you and your business without really having tinkered with it. I'm not even saying, has it been deployed effectively in your industry, but has it been built? Has the model been built, or has the solution been thought about in the context of the problem you're trying to solve, rather than being the hammer looking for a nail? That's always the first thing that I think about, is that industry knowledge. The second is, as you start to think about a consulting firm or advice from anyone, do they know you? And if so, it could be advantageous if they already know your technology environment, if they already know your agenda, your priorities, and if they're able to come in and say, here's where we can deploy AI to accelerate the goals that you're trying to achieve. That's huge. As a consultant, there's a lot of value, I think, to consulting, used in the right way with the right context and right knowledge. But that doesn't have to come from a consultant. That can very much come from a startup that's working with depth in your industry.
Yeah, and I think through those conversations between consultants and enterprise, you understand a bit more. You start to understand as an enterprise, what things should you build versus not build? How much of that do you do in-house versus partner, either with a consulting firm or with a software vendor? And so there's a lot of acceleration of learnings, right? And I think that's where a lot of the initial discussions have been the last 2 years is, let's go learn, let's experiment, let's get things into POCs and pilots, and then some will hit production, right? So, and I'm curious, like 2 years in, where do you think we are in that maybe timetable? Are companies now firmly in production with a lot of things that they started to build out? Are we still in an era where things are still more or less in like POCs and pilots? I'm curious, like what the temperature in the room is more broadly based on what you've seen.
Probably to answer that, we would need to be more specific in terms of the use cases. So when we talk about things like efficiency, maybe in servicing a client or a policy, if I call the call center to update my beneficiary or update my address, as opposed to in underwriting, where there's a much more scrutiny with regulators, there's a lot more concern of making the right underwriting decision for the carrier. In the servicing context, I think we're seeing a lot of efficiencies, and the focus is still thematically very much on efficiency. In underwriting, I think as an industry, we're still appropriately cautious in how we're deploying it. So I'm hearing a lot more about proper deployments on operations, efficiency, solutions like that. And I'm hearing much more in terms of pilots on underwriting, even some of the claims handling, where it's still perhaps more in pilot stage than it is fully deployed. And that's, of course, there's a spectrum. I'm sure we could come up with any number of list of names of carriers that have already deployed very effectively in any number of situations.
That makes sense. It depends on which types of work is being worked on with generative AI. And so there's some more sensitive areas where it's a little bit earlier than maybe some other areas that it's been a little bit quicker to experiment and adopt. Do you have maybe a customer story or case study that you could share of you know, maybe a major carrier or someone that has successfully navigated this transformation journey using some of the latest around generative AI?
Maybe before you can get to successfully navigated, one thing I would say is there is a lot of value in moving forward. Even 2 years ago, I feel like there were a lot of conversations about whether there was benefit of being the first mover in this or not. I think there's all of those perspectives are still relevant and worthwhile. It's a healthy debate to have, but at this point, exposure within the organization is can only benefit. I think about working with a wealth management firm last year. And within certain contexts, there was a theme going around, in my opinion, about, out of an abundance of caution, we are going to not allow any AI tools until we have a strategy, until we have a plan, until we figure out our official approach. We're not going to deploy. A week later, I happened to be sitting down with a financial advisor. And he, at this firm, which had said, no use of AI anywhere, anyhow. And he's like, let me tell you how this has changed my life. It's amazing. And so he shows me how he's got his personal iPad out, how he has the personal iPad listen in on his call with the client and do exactly the use case that we've all seen at this point. It summarizes the call. It highlights the action items. It drafts his first response back to the client to follow up. And then he has it send from his personal email to his work email, and then he just copies and pastes it into the CRM system. So I feel like at this point, the cat is out of the bag, or whatever analogy you'd like to use, right? The barn doors are open. So finding a way to make sure that your organization is at least starting that journey of exposure, even if you're still cautious in terms of how you're using it or what use cases you're going to prioritize. So that's my first caution. The second is I feel like I'm still hearing about organizations that are spending a lot of money on their AI strategy at the expense of actually playing with it. But let's make it sound as low stakes as possible, right? Let's just play with it. So however you might want to do that, right? Whether that's a pilot, whether that's a couple people within the organization in your young leaders program, any number of ways. But there needs to be some way that you're actually moving forward with it and not just spending money building out use cases and prioritizing and playing with things on a whiteboard, essentially, rather than actually trying it out and seeing how it works within your context and environment. I would put the question back towards you, Ankur. Like, what are you seeing these days?
Well, first, I agree with your advice. I mean, this is just generally true with any new technology. It's much, much better to go and get your hands on it and try working with it. You'll learn a lot more. It actually de-risks future investments because you've learned and developed some scar tissue along the way, right? And some things you'll be disappointed by, and some things you'll learn from, and you can move forward in production with. Now, you do want to de-risk it. I'm not saying go and launch this so it's customer facing and it's going to go and run amok, but do smaller scale experiments and do a lot of them to learn quickly, right? The velocity at which you learn will be really important. And when I run a startup, Multimodal, I've done startups before. The same philosophy applies. You want to go and get your hands on the technology, experiment with it, have incredible product velocity. Not everything will make it into the final product, but you will get so much incredible learning by just iteratively moving through that as quickly as possible. And as a startup, you have no choice, right? There's no safety net. All you have is forward momentum. And so you build very quickly and you iterate very quickly. You have incredible product velocity. So the only way you get to some escape velocity that then allows you to scale. Enterprises, because they don't have to worry about existential risk. I get it. Like sometimes the inertia is really strong. The status quo is still so good that you don't feel like this pressure to go in and try to move more quickly. But I think that incorporating that like almost like startup type mentality around adoption of new technology, I think is really, really critical.
If nothing else, it also helps you identify more quickly where you're going to run into problems. right? So how do we plug this in? What is the state of our data? If we're going to use our own data in our model, can we use it? Are there things we're going to have to do before we can scale this? So getting to a sense of where those challenges and pitfalls may be sooner helps a lot as well.
Completely agreed. And I think there's a lot you could learn by working with different, or I'll say, categories of partners, right? If you look at like large carriers and enterprise financial institutions and such, they could work with their hyperscalers. And there's a lot that's coming out from the hyperscalers that's of value, as straightforward as use Azure OpenAI or Copilot, like Microsoft Copilot or Copilot Studio. And then you have the equivalent versions in some cases like GCP Vertex or AWS Bedrock. But you could go and get your engineering teams to experiment directly with like the lowest level building blocks from the hyperscalers. You go and work with the consulting firms of choice that you have to learn quickly about what are they seeing, what use cases have they worked on or informed on, can they quickly kind of inject some new knowledge that they're seeing. And at the same time, I think there's been an openness which has been kind of more refreshing to see. It wasn't necessarily the case 10 years ago, where enterprises are open to conversations with startups. And I highly encourage it. And I encourage it for the following reasons. Startups absorb information more quickly than almost anyone else because they have to, right? Like there is that existential risk that you always face, which is like you have to be the best in the world at adopting new technology and bringing it to market. And if you don't, you won't be in business. And if you do, then you might get a chance to go and have a beautiful scale up. And so they are seeing a lot, they're experimenting a lot, and you as an enterprise can see that and learn from that. Not every startup is going to make for a great long-term partner, but by having more of those conversations, by engaging in more POCs with the best of the crop that you come across, you'll inject some of that. You could still decide, hey, like you don't want to work with a startup, you'd rather do it directly yourself, or maybe work with a hyperscaler to go and do it, but you start learning a lot. And I think this is an era where the pace and velocity of learning really matters and then allows you to kind of figure out what's really worth doing long term. Where do you invest it? But maybe to answer your earlier question, Emily, I think what we're seeing is that there are some organizations that have gone through more learning that have a little bit more of that innovation forward mindset. And they're thinking, it used to be chatbots and co-pilots. Now it's all like AI agents and agentic AI. And I'm sure there will be different flavors, although we obviously do AI agents. We think that there's huge value in having action-oriented versions of AI. That's really what AI agents are all about. There's huge benefits, and the ones that we talk to some of the companies we talk to at least have a more fully formed vision. They're thinking 3 to 5 years. We have like 50 different workflows across the organization that we need to build out this technology in. We've tackled a small sliver, maybe 5 or 10, but how do we go tackle 50 or 100? And now they're thinking, okay, well, how much do they do in-house? How much do they go and work with external vendors with, like consulting firms or startups? But they have more fully formed visions. Now, they're still far from accomplishing that, but they've thought through the trade-offs, the total cost of ownership, the rigor of trying to get these online, because they've had kind of a couple of reps of doing POCs and pilots and trying to push into production. There are others that are, I think it's in some ways like they want to take things really slowly. And I get that abundance of caution, but they're still doing smaller scale experiments. They're still like overthinking some of the initial foray into generative AI. So they're just barely getting started with Microsoft Copilot a year after Copilot's out there. They're still working, in some cases, as sad as it is, they're still working with a GPT 3.5 in some cases, which is shocking because like OpenAI is at 4.0, right? And their Anthropic models are incredibly good. Their Mistral and Llama models are incredibly good. So because they work very cautiously, they're still working on their older technology, taking the limits of that technology as a given, and then still like working through that. It's like unfortunate because they're going to be so far behind some of the players that I mentioned earlier because the players that are in the former camp have experimented more quickly, right? So we're seeing a very wide distribution of progress. And what we believe is that there's going to be a very wide distribution of outcomes given the camps that some of these organizations belong in.
The sense of urgency can't be stressed enough. That was a theme in what you just said, Ankur, right? If you have that urgency to see results, trying to DIY it internally and have for instance, say our tech team will be able to build our models without outside support of, frankly, even from a startup, right? Where they're exactly like you're saying, right? Your reps are just so much faster. You're learning, you're adopting new technology and new solutions so much faster than any carrier could conceivably do internally on their own. So this is an area where having that outside expertise can go a long, long way to accomplishing results.
But I know we've talked a lot about maybe the technology side, which is important, right? It's great to get reps and learn. But I think so much of the problem here is actually more business oriented and change management. Just because the technology is really advanced doesn't mean the organization is ready to go and bring it online. And then you have to work with employees feeling comfortable, not disrupting their flows and processes the way that they do work. And so absorbing some of the things that come out of maybe the engineering function around the new technology is really, really critical. Navigating that's really critical, right? And I think sometimes like the bulk of the problem is there, not in the technology itself. So I'm curious, what do you think are some of the best practices around how to take this technology? Let's say you've got it out of a POC and pilot, it's ready for like game time. You could introduce into production, but then you have to make sure that it's released in a way where the organization, the business owners, the business operators actually adopt it, right? There isn't like this maybe initial gut reaction to push that technology aside or rebel against it because it's foreign, it's new, maybe there's skepticism around it. So how do we deal with this change management issue?
My first reminder to anyone on the topic of change management is change management is change management. It is always needed whenever there is some change that's being introduced. The difference with AI is just the pace of change, and it's going to continue. So this isn't just, hey, we've found a way to make your 20-step process 18 steps and save you 0.35 seconds, in step 12. But we need you to adopt this change. This is going to change processes significantly, and it's going to continue to improve processes. So it's really thinking about change as an ongoing effort, and the transformation. Back to where we started the conversation, are we done, or is this going to be our status quo? This is going to become our status quo. We're going to continually improve and continually accelerate what we're doing and how we're doing it for the good of the employees and our clients. So in some ways, there's nothing, in my opinion, that's unique and different in terms of the change management required for AI compared to any other change that we've been talking about for decades. But considering the pace of change, that's not going to be one and done, is how things start to have to be tinkered as we think about a change management effort. So all of the usual solutions apply. Show the benefit, right? Show how the original process and the new process look different, how it saves time, how it decreases, potential for errors, how any employee has fewer redundant tasks, and how they can do things better. I recall, this is pre-AI days, but I was out in a call center in the middle of Texas, and we were doing some automation improvements in the flow of screens that show up when someone calls into the call center. And so I happened to be talking to one of the call center reps and just asked her, what is the one thing we could do that would improve your life? And she thinks about it. Her answer is, I could use 2 screens. That would really make me more efficient. And for all the people out there with 2 screens, I support you in that is true. But what was so fascinating to me about that is the most that this CSR rep could conceive in terms of change was a second screen. And what we're going to be doing with AI is just going to blow past that radically, even more so than what we were doing 8 years ago for improvement. And so in some ways, we're going to have to show what the benefit is. We're not going to be able to rely on individuals' imaginations. Things are going to come up that even you and I have never conceived of. They're going to be possible, and it's exciting. But the showing, and the telling, are going to both be important.
Yeah, and I think the emphasis is on showing over time, which is like, here are the areas that it's been helpful. This is how it's been helpful. Evangelizing that as much as possible really becomes important, right? And that's when I think we'll hit a tipping point. Because I do still feel like it's early innings. As much as we talk about AI, as much as the industry talks about AI, when you think about adoption, particularly in these verticals that we're speaking about, right? Insurance, it takes time for that adoption to happen. And the adoption is still very much in early innings because there's so much involved. And so I think this will only accelerate in the next few years because you'll have more showing of here's where the success is, here's how. And then once you see it, you cannot then forget it, right? Like it's visible, it's there. You're like, I want that. Let's go build that immediately. And when that happens, is a tipping point. All the dominoes start falling because you see one carrier do it or one big FI do it. You're like, I have to have that. I want to do what they did. And at some point, it's not just like excitement. It's like a fear response because it's like FOMO, right? Like you don't want to miss out. You want to be left hanging, right? And so you really then start embracing some of this in a way that we haven't even quite seen just yet.
And when it starts to become apparent to financial advisors, when it makes their lives easier, but ultimately makes the clients' lives easier and it's visible to clients, that's when it starts to become a self-fulfilling virtuous cycle.
How much of this technology is still internal facing? So advisors use it and then kind of take the benefits and then relay it to the end user versus how much of it directly affects the end user and customer?
So probably we would need to double click a little bit on that, how we define different things. What is AI really compared to what we might have been doing 3 to 5 years ago with natural language processing? So in some ways, have we already introduced solutions that today we're calling AI, but in prior iterations we called something different, and they are part of our solution. They are visible to clients. They do serve. There's a significant benefit across the supply chain. That said, for what we today call AI and some of the use cases, I still think there's a healthy caution in terms of making sure that there's not decisions being made that could have potential impact without a human still involved and doing some level of verification or validation. In our regulated industry, in a lot of ways, that's appropriate caution. And as collectively as an industry, we come further in our comfort level and maturity with models, probably that will naturally decrease. But I would say right now, we're still in the healthy caution stage, and that's probably not inappropriate.
How much is regulation or uncertainty around regulation a hindrance to adopting some of this new technology?
We could just talk about regulation in general, and the benefit or not of regulation. In a lot of ways, what is the purpose of regulation? The purpose of regulation is to protect consumers, by and large, and that is not unhealthy. So how do we think about that, and what is in the benefit of consumers? How do we confirm or affirm that something is to the benefit of a consumer? I think maybe this goes back to some of what we were talking about in terms of adoption and change management. Make the results visible. If a model needs to be audited, make that easy to do for internal teams, the users, even if you have to show results to regulators, so that you can build confidence as you move forward.
As we look at 2025 and some things to come, what do you think is one development around maybe the adoption of AI or some of the work that you're seeing these carriers and FIs go through that you think is going to surprise at least some of the people in the industry right now?
I would like to think that we're going to very quickly get past the efficiency use cases and into something that's much more market facing. And I think for me, where I'm most excited is when we can put the right product, financial product, with the right individual need at the right time, in a way that whether we call it prediction, whether we call it being able to use that information in a cost-effective and effective way for that individual. I'm excited for that, so that we're moving towards the purpose of our whole industry, and being able to do that even better than we do today.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting to see because I think right now we're barely scratching at what's possible, right? There's so much more other areas beyond efficiency that we could touch. So it'll be really incredible to see. Well, Emily, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. For our audience that would love to learn more about what you're doing, where could they find you?
LinkedIn is always the first place to start.
Amazing.
Parker, it's been a
We'll
pleasure.
include then. Yeah, appreciate the time here.
Likewise, always enjoy getting to chat.